Welcome to the 20th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through how to publish, update, and delete workbooks maintained on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance using Tableau Server Client. To publish a workbook on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance, you will need to create a workbook object or item. To create a workbook object, the name and project ID for which you would like to publish the workbook to is required. Additionally, when publishing, you must specify location in the form of a file path for which the workbook you are attempting to publish currently resides. To update an existing workbook, you simply need to specify the workbook object and corresponding attributes or properties you would like to update. And to delete a workbook, simply provide the locally unique identifier value associated with the workbook. In most instances, you will not have memorized a workbook's locally unique identifier value, so I recommend first fetching the workbook object to get the necessary value. To showcase each type of request, let us jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin developing a script that publishes a workbook to my Tableau Cloud instance, updates the same workbook's owner, and finally deletes that workbook. Okay, to get started, we're going to need to execute this configuration/setup block. If you're unfamiliar with this block, I highly recommend you checking out tutorial 2 of this series. In that tutorial, I walk you through how to connect to your Tableau server or Tableau Cloud instance for the first time. A high-level overview of this block and what it does is it's going to allow us to create and configure our authentication object, which is composed of 3 parameters. So we have a token name, token value, and a site ID. Additionally, we'll configure a Tableau Server Client object, which is going to be basically our server address. We're going to create the server object. We're going to use both of those together to authenticate and sign in to our Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be connecting to my Tableau Cloud instance. But before we do that, and before we jump into learning how to publish a workbook to my Tableau Cloud instance programmatically, I first want to jump over to my Tableau Cloud instance so you can see the layout and to dive deeper into how we're going to go about doing this and what is actually needed. So we jump over there now. And if we look at this, my Tableau Cloud instance, you'll notice that I have 5 parent projects, or 5 top-level projects, which are indeed parent projects themselves. We have the default project, Europe sales, external assets default projects, North America sales, and samples. The idea here for the purposes of this tutorial is we're going to publish a workbook to the Europe sales project, and within that project there are child projects or sub-projects. And the project that we actually want to publish to is we want to publish in the workbooks project. Throughout this tutorial, I'm going to use project and the word folder. I'm going to try my best to refer to a folder or a project as a project. So those are synonymous terms as it relates to Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud. If you're thinking about your file system or your directory on your local machine, projects are folders. So if you hear me accidentally say folder, know that I mean project and vice versa. Okay, so the idea here is to publish our workbook to this project within the Europe sales project, right? The issue that we're going to face here, and I've introduced this complexity just because you're more than likely going to have this complexity on your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance, is that you have multiple folders or projects named the same, right? So I have a workbooks project within the European sales project, but I also have one for North America sales, right? So the layout or the strategy for creating these child projects across multiple projects is the same. So for European sales and North America sales, I have a data quality alerts, a data sources project, a flows project, and a workbooks project. So I can't, when I'm trying to publish this workbook, I can't specify that I want to publish to the workbooks project. Why? Because it's ambiguous, right? There's 2 of them. There's one currently in North America sales, and there's also one in Europe sales. So I need to determine a way to programmatically figure out how to say that I want to publish to the workbooks project within European sales or Europe sales. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back over to Visual Studio Code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first figure out what is the project ID of Europe sales, the parent project to the workbooks project for which I want to publish to. And using that, I can then determine, okay, I have that parent project ID. Now I want to get the workbooks project that has a parent project ID equal to the product ID of Europe sales, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say create a filter for the project for which the workbook will be published. And again, the reason we're doing this is because there are multiple workbooks projects. So the one with the parent project name of Europe sales, we have to identify that programmatically. So say parent project is equal to server.projects. We're going to be using the project's endpoint. And I'm going to apply a filter. So the name of that project, that parent project I want to filter to or retrieve, is going to be Europe sales. And I also want to get a list of projects that go by, or I want to get the projects that have a name of workbooks. And I'm going to use these two things to generate a list of projects that are called workbooks, right? So I have projects that are named workbooks, and I want to iterate through those until I find the project that has a name of workbooks that has a parent ID value equal to the ID value of the Europe sales project. So every project, so let's just go ahead and take a look at this real quick. So what I'm going to do is just to showcase what attributes are maintained for each project, I'm going to retrieve a project. So let me just do projects equals project for project and TSC pager server.projects. And I'm just going to comment this out. And let's just say projects. Let's get the first one. And let's see what attributes are maintained for that. Let me just double check this, project for project, and I need to do a close that square bracket. And let me print this actually, right? So let me print this out. And here are the attributes maintained for each project. So we have content permissions. So what is the model that's being enforced? So is it managed by owner? Is it customized? Is it locked to project? Things like that. The ID value. So this is important. This is the locally unique identifier value of the project. So for example, we want to grab the ID value or compare the parent project ID value to this value where it's equal to each other when we're trying to find the Europe sales parent project. We have the description. We have the parent ID. So if it's a parent project, then it does not have, if it's a top level project, it does not have a parent ID. But for our workbooks project, so I'm just going to go ahead and showcase this for projects and projects, print project._dict. Okay, so these are our projects, and we're looking for a workbooks project, right? So we have a workbooks project here, and it has a parent ID value that's maintained for it, right? So we want to get the workbooks project that has a parent ID value equal to the ID value of the product name Europe sales. So Europe sales is here, and the ID of that is B97B and so forth, right? So if I look at these two workbooks projects, there's one here and there's one here. This is the one that we're actually after, right? So it's named workbooks, which is pretty ambiguous, right? Because there's two of them. But this one is tied or is underneath, it's a child project to the parent project Europe sales, right? Because you see the ID here. Basically, we're trying to do this programmatically so that we get the right workbooks project. So this is again, so for each project, you have these attributes maintained for each, and we're going to use that to our advantage here. So let's go ahead and backspace this. Let's go ahead and take this out because we don't need this. Let's uncomment this out and get back on track. So I'm going to say project is equal to project for project and projects if project.parentID is equal to parent project 0.id. Okay, so this is basically doing programmatically what we just did manually and visually here, right? So we're matching up where there's a workbooks project that has a parent ID value equal to a project's ID value, right? Because this is going to return the parent project because we only have one parent project with the name of Europe Sales. This is going to retrieve the products that have the name of Workbooks, which is going to ultimately retrieve a list of projects that have the name Workbooks, so just 2. And then among those 2, we're going to find just the one that is tied to or underneath the Europe Sales project. Okay, so let's go ahead and test that, right? So I'm going to say project, let's just do print project dot. We're just going to take this first one because there should only be one. Underscore dict to see those values. And there you are. So you'll notice the ID. So this is the ID for the Workbooks project that sits or lives in the Europe Sales project, which we recognize this locally unique identifier as being the project ID for the Europe Sales project. Okay, so that is the complexity I wanted to introduce in this tutorial. I know I kind of just probably went a little bit too deep into it, but it's absolutely something that you're likely to run into immediately when you try to implement something like this in the real world, right? If you're using your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance, your folder structures or your product structures and hierarchies are probably going to cause you to have projects with the same name. Okay, so we have now identified the project for which we want to publish. What we need to do now is we need to configure the workbook item. So I'm going to say configure the workbook item because we need to create one of these. I'm going to say new workbook is equal to tsc.workbook item. And I'm going to pass in the 2 required values. So the 2 required values here are going to be the name of the workbook. And I'm going to call this Europe Sales Open Pipeline. So Salesforce type of stuff. And the project ID that we're going to publish to is equal to the project ID of the parent project. The Workbooks project that lives in Europe Sales. Okay, so we have our new workbook item configured. We have to do that because we're going to use the publish method at the workbooks endpoint to publish this workbook to that location with that name. All right, let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to say publish the new workbook to the Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance. Again, in this case, I have a Tableau Cloud instance. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a try except else block to attempt to publish the workbook. If there is a error raised, I'm going to print out unable to publish the workbook name. Otherwise, if we're successfully able to publish the workbook, I'm going to print out the workbook was successfully published. So let's go ahead and do that now. So try server.workbooks.publish. So we're using the workbooks endpoint and the publish method. What are we going to publish? We're going to publish that workbook that we configured here. So it's called new workbook. And this method is going to take 3 parameters that we absolutely need. We need the workbook item. We need the file path. So the file path is the file path for which the workbook resides on my local file system. So my local machine. So let's do that now. And then, so I'm going to say workbook item is equal to new workbook. And where is this file located at? Well, it's located at a specific place on my file system. So let me go ahead and copy and paste that location. And I'm using the pathlib library to create a path object here. So if you notice the top of this script, I did import path from pathlib just to make this easy. The next parameter is going to be the method for creating a workbook or publishing a workbook. In this case, I am going to be creating a new workbook altogether. So I'm going to be saying mode is equal to create new. You can technically also overwrite, right? So if this workbook is pre-existing on your server, you can simply publish over that, right? It's good as long as it has the same name, right? So if you're going to overwrite, you obviously want to be overwriting the same workbook by name on the server. Okay, so there are 2 other optional parameters to this method, connection details and asJob. So connection details will allow you to embed the connection information required to connect to the embedded data source. The asJob parameter will allow you to set it to true if you want to perform this job asynchronously. By default, it is false. And the connection details by default are none. So I'm going to leave those two out. The next thing we got to do here, so it's a try except else block. So what are we going to do if there is an error? I'm going to use a bare except here. Not always the best thing to do, but in this case, if there's any error raised, the result is the workbook does not publish. So we say unable to publish new workbook.name. And if we're successful in this endeavor, I'm going to say we were successfully able to print. So I'm going to say new workbook. Sorry, publish, not print. That name successfully published. Okay. Let me scroll down so we can see this and just recap what we're doing here. So we are using a context manager to authenticate and sign into my Tableau server. This is going to allow me to ensure that once I have finished this block here, that I actually sign out of my server. I am going to look up the project ID for which the Workbooks project lives in. So this Workbooks project, we're going to be publishing the workbook to a project named Workbooks. But because there are two Workbooks folders or projects on my server, this is ambiguous by itself, right? So I need to find the workbook project that lives in the Year of Sales project. And then in order to do that, I need to identify the project ID for the parent project Year of Sales, and then identify which Workbooks project has a parent ID attribute equal to the project ID attribute of the parent project. All right, so we did that. We configured a new workbook item by providing a name and the project ID for which we want to publish. Again, that is going to be the Workbooks project that lives in Europe Sales. We then use the try except else block to attempt to publish this workbook to my Tableau Cloud instance. If we're unsuccessful, we're going to print out that we're unable to publish the workbook by its name. So in this case, it'd say unable to publish Europe Sales open pipeline. And if we're successful, we're going to do the same, except we're going to say successfully published. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. What do I have here? Okay, so I need to run this first block here. So let's run this first block. And let's go ahead and run this again. Unable to publish Europe Sales open pipeline. So let me see on my server. So let me go to my server and make sure I have it configured correctly. Okay, so the issue was here. So I navigated to my server, and the issue why I got this error is because I'm trying to create new, but there's already a workbook on my server that is named Europe Sales open pipeline. So what I did just now is I deleted that from my server. This would successfully execute if this mode was equal to overwrite. So I deleted the workbook. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to run this again. And we successfully published. So what I want to do now is I want to switch over to my Tableau Cloud instance so that you can see this firsthand. So on my screen now, you're going to be able to see, okay, I have an empty folder called Workbooks, or a project, and it lives in Europe Sales. If I refresh this, we're going to be able to see that there is now a workbook called Europe Sales Open Pipeline that we just published. And here it is. Okay, so we successfully published. You'll see the modified date and time is today's date and time because we just published it. That is publishing workbooks. The next step we want to take, and I'm going to jump back over to Visual Studio Code, is we want to update this workbook's owner, right? So I publish it underneath a particular creator ID. I want to transfer the ownership of that workbook to another creator or another user in this case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do largely the same thing. So I'm going to have a context manager to sign in and authenticate with the server. But instead of publishing a workbook, I'm simply going to update its properties. And how am I going to do that? Well, the first step I need to take is to be able to programmatically identify which workbook I am trying to update. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to create a workbook filter for the update request. And to do that, you've seen this in my other videos. We're going to say workbook is equal to server.workbooks.filter. So we're using the workbooks endpoint, and we're going to filter our workbooks listing to a workbook named Europe Sales Open Pipeline. And this is case sensitive, so we need to make sure that this is exactly character for character and case for case the same. So we say Europe sales and then open pipeline. So that's going to retrieve the specific workbook that we need. Another step I'm going to take is I'm going to create a user filter because I want to ensure that the user that I'm transferring this workbook to or attempting to actually exists. So later on here in just a moment, I'm going to use a Pythonic way to verify that the workbook exists so that this filter returns an actual result. And the user filter also returns a result. So we're going to check that the workbook exists and the user exists for which I'm transferring the ownership to before we attempt to update the workbook's ownership properties or the owner ID properties. So let's do that now. So I'm going to say create a user filter for the update request. This will look exactly the same, just different endpoint, different filter. So I'm going to say user is equal to server dot users dot filter, and the name of this is going to be the display name. So in this case on Tableau Cloud, the display name is, as far as I know, it's always going to be the email address. That could be customizable. I'm not sure if this is part of a developer program or instance that I don't have site administration access to. So I'm not sure if that can be configured differently. But for now, this user that we're going to transfer the ownership to is basically to another email address that I own. So soloqlegend and this is sql@gmail.com. And the idea is I'm going to take the workbook and transfer the ownership to this user. Okay, so we're going to make use of both of those filters. We're going to say retrieve the specific workbook object requiring updates if it exists. All right, so if workbook and user. So we're saying if the workbook and the user exist, and this is just a Pythonic way of checking that this is not empty, right? We didn't get an empty result set for this filter, right? The workbook was able to be found with this name. The user was able to be found with this name. Okay, so if both of those things exist, we're going to say workbook is equal to workbook 0. So we're going to slice this, right? The first item in this is going to be the workbook that was returned. So there's only one workbook called Europe Sales Open Pipeline. We're going to identify that as a workbook object. Same thing with the user, we say equals user 0. And then I'm going to update the workbook owner. So update the workbook's owner. To do that, I'm going to modify the owner ID attribute of the workbook object. So I'm going to say workbook dot owner ID is equal to user.id. So I'm basically taking this workbook object that I retrieved from my cloud instance and modifying the owner ID attribute to be equal to the user ID of the user we filtered to, right? So of this user, because I want to transfer the ownership to that user. All right, so let's go ahead and do another try except else block. So I'm just going to put this in here. So except else. So what do we want to do? We want to try to transfer the ownership by updating the properties of the workbook object. So I'm going to say server.workbooks.update. So I'm going to use the update method at the workbooks endpoint. So what am I going to update? I'm going to update that workbook. And if we fail to do so, so if an error is raised, I'm going to print out that feedback to the user. So I'm going to say unable to update the owner for the, I'm going to say what we were trying to update. And if we are successful, let's go ahead and print out a similar message. Print successfully updated the owner for the book.name. Okay. And otherwise, so we went through this branch here, right? This block here is going to be executed if the workbook exists and the user exists on my Tableau Cloud instance. If neither of these things are true, if both of these things aren't true, let's just say that. If both of these things aren't true, then I'm going to say that the workbook, or we'll say and or user not found. So this operation can't be completed if either of these things are not true, right? I can't transfer the ownership of something that doesn't exist to a user that does exist, and I can't transfer the ownership of a workbook that does exist to a user that doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and try this now. So let's go ahead and execute this. All right, so we got the feedback message saying successfully updated, and that should be updated, right? So updated the owner of for the year of sales open pipeline workbook. Let's verify that. So let's go to my Tableau Cloud instance. Let's click this. And what we're going to see is it's been transferred from Chris Perry with another email address to Chris Perry with the soloqlegend@gmail.com email address. So we successfully transferred the ownership here. You can see right here at the user that that's been done. Here's the email. Just to show you what I'm talking about, I have two users with the same name, but just different email addresses for this instance. So previously, this workbook was owned by Chris Perry, but with this email address, and we transferred the ownership to this Chris Perry. In the real world, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be transferring it from one person to another person, and those people are going to be unique, right? And you probably aren't going to do this with just a single workbook. You're probably going to maybe read in a file into Pandas, right? And then you're going to do these in bulk, right? You may do a bulk migration, or you may take all of the objects from one person. So say Chris Perry to John, to transfer all of Chris's workbooks, data sources, flows, all of the objects or content that's maintained by Chris, transfer that to John, right? So in the real world, you probably aren't going to just do these one, like you're just not going to just transfer one workbook, right? This is just to showcase the usefulness of being able to do this programmatically. All right, so let's jump back over to Visual Studio Code to walk through the final step here in this tutorial. So we're going to do the same. So we started off with publishing the workbook. We updated one of the properties, the ownership, and now we're going to delete the workbook. In the real world, you wouldn't do these three things subsequently, right? So you wouldn't waste your time publishing something, updating it just to delete it, right? But this is the showcase each of the three methods that are super important and useful for automating manual tasks on your Tableau server or Tableau Cloud instance. So publishing, updating, and deleting. All right, so let's do the same thing. So we're using a context manager to sign and authenticates. We're going to call use highest version to ensure that we're using the most recent API version that's supported by our Tableau server or Tableau Cloud instance. And the first thing we're going to do, well, if we're going to delete something, just like if we're going to update something, we have to programmatically determine which workbook we're trying to update, right? So I'm just going to copy and paste this. This just makes sense instead of sitting here letting you watch me type. We need the workbook that we're going to delete. So we're going to delete this workbook. And then I'm going to say retrieve. And I will do the same thing. I'm just going to actually copy and paste this. I do not want to sit here and make you watch me type. So if the workbook exists, we're just, for deletions, we're not going to need to check for the existence of a user or create a user filter request. We simply need to know if the workbook exists, let's delete it. All right. So if workbook, then workbook is equal to workbook 0. And let's delete that workbook. So same idea, try accept else. And then let's populate these blocks. So to publish a workbook, we use the publish method. To update a workbook's properties, we use the update method. To delete a workbook, you guessed it, we're going to use the delete method. So I'm going to say try server.workbooks.delete. And what am I going to delete? So in this case, we're not going to pass the entire workbook object. So when we updated the workbook, we had to pass the entire object. This method is actually just going to take the workbook ID. So the locally unique identifier known to Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud. So let's do workbook ID is equal to workbook.id. So we're going to delete the workbook based on the ID attributes of the workbook that we returned with this filter, right? So I'm going to be deleting the year of sales open pipeline workbook by passing in its ID value for the attribute ID. Okay. So if there's an exception raised, let's do this, same idea. Let's notify the user, have some sort of feedback loop. Unable to delete workbook.name. And if we're successful, let's go ahead and do the same. Okay. If the workbook doesn't exist, we're going to say the workbook was unable to be found. So let's go ahead and run this. And there we have it. We successfully deleted Europe Sales Open Pipeline Workbook from my Tableau Cloud instance. Just to recap what we did here, we signed in using a context manager. We ensured we're using the highest or the most recent API version supported by my Tableau Cloud instance. We created the filter request to ensure that we're able to retrieve the workbook called Europe Sales Open Pipeline on my Tableau Cloud instance. So we got that object, the workbook object. And if this filter returned an actual workbook, so it's not an empty request or an empty object, we're going to go ahead and grab that workbook, so assign that workbook to a variable, and we're going to try to delete it, right? So we're going to use the workbooks endpoint and the delete method at that endpoint. We're going to pass in the workbook ID associated with this workbook that we retrieved. And if we're successful, we're going to tell the user we successfully deleted that workbook, otherwise unable to delete that workbook. If the workbook doesn't exist, in other words, this request to return a workbook called Europe Sales Open Pipeline is empty, as there's nothing in it. So no results were returned. We're going to say workbook not found. And that's the gist of this, right? So it follows the same pattern as the other methods. Some of the parameters are a little bit different depending on the method that you're using. But yeah, let's go ahead and verify this on my Tableau Cloud instance that we deleted this. So I'm going to go back to my Tableau Cloud instance. And let's navigate back to the Workbooks project within Europe Sales. And what we're going to see is that there's actually nothing going to be in here now. And there it is. So we have no workbooks published here at this point because we've deleted it from the cloud instance programmatically using Python and Tableau Server Client. Before I wrap up this video, I want to showcase an area where you can find all of these scripts that I've covered in my tutorials up until now and all the future ones. So on my GitHub, you will be able to find a repository called Tableau Server Client. And in there, I have all of my scripts. So all the way from the beginning. So getting started, connecting to your server for the first time, generating reports, refreshing data. So programmatically triggering the execution of flows, linked tasks, or extract refreshes, and all the way up until now, right? So today we walked through updating, adding, and removing workbook objects from my Tableau Cloud instance. You're going to be able to find those scripts here. These are cleaned up, so they're, when I say nearly ready to go, what I mean by that is give you a really good template here. You simply need to swap out, in this case, the means for which you store and retrieve your tokens, your server, obviously, and just any of these like bells and whistles or enhancements that you want to do to this code, right? The file path is obviously going to be different too, but it gives you a very good starting point and it's cleaned up for the most part. Same thing with deletes and updates, same idea. It's all right here. You can take these as your starting point and just build onto it. All right. Well, that wraps up this video on modifying workbooks programmatically through Tableau Server Clients. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance through automation. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.